government when in 1788 it offered advances to 10 pioneer planters trying to grow indigo in Lower Bengal by using West Indian methods. Since then indigo industry never functioned as a proper plantation economy, as with no right to buy land until 1829, the planters had to persuade, and later force, the local peasants to accept advances to produce indigo in their lands. This created enough scope for friction, because demand remained uncertain, and it was with an eye on the needs of the remittance trade, rather than the requirements of English textile manufacturers, that the amount of production was monitored. The system became more exploitative and coercive day by day, leading to the Indigo Rebellion in 1859 to 60.153. As for other crops, there is a persistent view that the peasants were forced to cultivate cash crops because of high revenue demand, the necessity to pay revenue and rent in cash, and above all for debt servicing. This view is refuted by the fact that there was always a positive correlation between the price of a crop and the cropped acreage, indicating profit motive behind the peasant's decision for preferring a particular cropping pattern. But at the same time it was only the rich peasants who could go for cash crops, and they too remained immensely vulnerable to the fluctuations in the market. In western India, for example, cotton cultivation grew in response to the cotton boom in the 1860s caused by the American Civil War. It created a pocket of prosperity in the Deccan Cotton Belt, which disappeared very soon after the end of the war and was followed by a famine and agrarian riots in the 1870s. Jute cultivation in eastern India developed as the peasants failed to meet the subsistence necessities and hoped to earn more by cultivating the golden crop. So an economic motive was certainly there in peasants' decision to shift to jute cultivation. But as Sugata Bose has shown, the primary producers could hardly reap the benefit of the boom in jute market between 1906 and 1913, as jute manufacturers and exporters, majority of whom were British, were able to exercise their monopsony power as purchasers of raw jute, leaving the jute growers no space to bargain for prices. So how can the impact of commercialization of agriculture on Indian peasant society be assessed? By way of commenting on this question, Tirthankar Roy has argued that it is possible that the capitalists captured most or all of the increase in value added. The rich may have become richer. But that does not mean that the poor got poorer. 4. Total income had increased. 1s61 could argue, however, that if the rich got richer and the poor remained poor, though not poorer, or became just marginally better off, that was not a very happy state of development either. In other words, commercialization of agriculture did not benefit the majority of the peasants, although it would be hasty to conclude that it signified a transition from pre-capitalist to capitalist mode of production marked by the rise of a powerful rural capitalist class and the proletarianization of the peasantry. The jute economy crashed in the 1930s and was followed by a devastating famine in Bengal in 1943. It is difficult to establish a direct connection between commercialization and famines, even though cash crops in some areas might have driven out food grains from the better quality land, with consequent impact on output. But even if this had happened, it was an extremely localized phenomenon, as on the whole food crops and cash crops were produced simultaneously. When colonial rule came to an end, food crops were still being grown in 80% of the cropped acreage. But on the whole, as noted earlier, the aggregate production of food crops lagged behind population growth. In view of this, the claim of some historians that growth of trade and integration of markets through development of infrastructure actually increased food security and contained the chances and severity of famines in colonial India 160 remains at best a contentious issue, particularly in the context of the Bengal famine of 1943, which was preceded by a long period of consistently declining per capita entitlement of rice in the province. Railways are considered to be another contribution of British rule towards the development of modern economic infrastructure. India became, writes a modern historian, a nation with its local centres linked by rail to each other and to the world. L62 Yet, the very way the railways were constructed makes it clear that its main purpose was to serve the interests of the empire, rather than the needs of the Indian economy. In 1853 Lord Dalhousie took the decision to construct railways in India mainly to facilitate army movements. Gradually there arose another need to integrate the Indian market to open it to British imports, i.e., to connect the port cities to the internal markets and sources of raw materials. So British capital investments were invited with 5% or guaranteed interests to be paid, if necessary, from Indian revenues. The companies were given free land with 99 years lease, after the expiry of which the line would become government property. But any time before that, even a few months before the expiry of the lease, the companies could return the lines to the government and claim full compensation for all capital expended. In other words, they could enjoy 5% or guaranteed profit for 98 years and then get back all their capital. This made the railway projects, as Sabyasachi Bhattacharya describes them, an instance of private enterprise at public risk. It was quite natural, therefore, that between 1858 and 1869 Indian railways would attract capital investments to the tune of £70, 110,000. L3 The main purpose of this railway construction was to tie up the Indian hinterland in the interest of foreign trade, rather than favor Indian economic development. The construction planning favored this goal, as it connected the internal markets with the ports, but provided no interconnection between the internal market cities. The preferential freight charges also betrayed this motive. There were less freight charges for bulk manufactured goods traveling from the ports to the interior and raw materials from the interior to the ports, than vice versa. 164 Apart from this, the multiplier effect of the railway construction boom benefited British economy, as machinery, railway lines, and up to a stage even coal was imported from England. The transfer of technology remained confined to low technology areas, such as plate laying, bridge building, or tunneling, while in the high-tech area the expertise that was imported was never Indianese to develop a truly national technology. L6s And in certain cases the construction work disturbed ecology, subverted the natural sewage system, and in Bengal for example, created malaria epidemic in the 19th century. 1 About the railways, the nationalists often complained of constant drainage of wealth through payment of guaranteed interests. Encouraged a lot of wasteful construction. The government also invested directly in railway construction, mainly in the frontier regions to meet the needs of army movement or for famine lines in scarcity areas. The nationalists' main objection was against the selection of priority areas for such public investments, as many of them believed that irrigation would have been a more suitable area for such investment, promising higher social benefits. For a colonial government looking for profits, there was obviously less incentive for investment in irrigation. Thus the railways, as it seems, did not encourage Indian economic development as it did in industrializing Europe. Although agriculture was relatively favored, it did not become a growth sector either. But nevertheless, when the British left, in 1946-47 there were 65 to 17 kilometers of railway tracks in India, covering 78% of the total area. 167 The railways had also encouraged the construction of feeder roads and a few other strategic roads interconnecting different regions of India. This did certainly integrate the Indian market to some extent and provided a cheaper mode of transportation for both people and goods, which were taken advantage of by the Indian businesses at a later stage after independence. And finally, the railways certainly had significant social and cultural impact on Indian society and nation. 168 But those were, one should remember, the unintended results of British imperialism. The other nationalist complaint against the empire was about its adverse impact on Indian handicraft industries, which at the beginning of British rule in the mid-18th century used to supply about a quarter of all manufactured goods produced in the world 16 and constituted chief export items of European trade. Following the Industrial Revolution, Not only did this export demand gradually evaporate, but colonial rule opened the Indian markets for British manufactured goods and led to deindustrialization or destruction of indigenous handicraft industries, reducing the number of people dependent on secondary industries. Initially, the British imported goods, mainly woolen textiles, had a limited market in India, but then Industrial Revolution changed the scenario. The preferential tariff policies between 1878 and 1895 were meant to solve a crisis in British industrial economy, which could be overcome by having a captive market in India, now being integrated by the railways. Thus, disappearance of export demand as well as invasion of the home market by cheap manufactured goods from England resulted in the destruction of craft industries. For India, its obvious outcome was increasing pressures on land and pauperism. However, some modern economic historians have questioned this nationalist thesis. They argue, first of all, that the rate of deindustrialization, if it did occur at all, is difficult to quantify, because of the paucity of reliable data and also multiple occupations of the Indian artisans, many of whom were often involved in agriculture as well. And if the cotton weavers are supposed to be the chief victims of this onslaught of cheap Manchester-produced cotton textile, there is enough evidence to suggest that the Indian handlooms continued to produce coarse cotton cloth for the poorer consumers at home well up to 1930s, when they were overtaken only by the Indian mill-produced goods. 170 some other recent researches, however, reveal that the nationalist position might not have been so incorrect after all, as the available statistical data from Gangetic Bihar clearly show that the proportion of industrial population to total population of that region declined from 18.6% in 1809 to 8.5% in 1901. Greater fall was in the percentage of weavers and spinners, whose proportion to the total industrial population declined drastically from 62.3 to 15.1% during the same period. 171 That does not bring the deindustrialization debate to a convenient conclusion, for it has been shown further that while employment declined, real income per worker in industry increased between 1900 and 194.7, and this did not indicate overall regress in the industrial situation. This rising industrial income was not certainly due to the intervention of modern industries in India, but, as Tirthankar Roy has argued, because of increasing per-worker productivity in the crafts. This was achieved through technological specialization and industrial reorganization, such as substitution of family labor with wage labor within the small-scale industry, which was mostly the case in the handloom textile sector. As Roy further suggests, there is also evidence of a significant rise in labor productivity in other small-scale industries as well, resulting from a process which he describes as commercialization. It included producing for non-local markets, a shift from local to long-distance trade, evolution of infrastructure and institutions to support that change, and shifts in consumer and producer behavior as a consequence of that. These factors helped artisanal industry, but did not lead to successful industrialization, with the necessary structural changes and economic development. 173 The basic occupational structure in the subcontinent remained substantially unchanged between 1881 and 1951, with agriculture providing for 70%, manufacturing 10%, and services 10 to 15%. Modem manufactures grew rapidly only after World War I, but the rate of increase in the overall income from the secondary sector before World War II was only 3.5% per annum, not fast enough to set India on the path of an industrial revolution. L74 One of the reasons behind this lack of overall economic development was that the colonial state in the 19th century was far from just a night watchman, as supposed by Morris D. Morris, 1968. Officially, the British government was committed to a laissez-faire policy, but actually it was a policy of discriminatory intervention, which amounted to, as one economic historian has described them, Non-market pressures exerted by the government. 11 As such pressures successfully nudged out Indian entrepreneurs like Jamsetji Bhoi 116 or Dwarkanath Tagore, 177, who still mistakenly believed in the idea of partnership. Since 1813, when Indian trade was freed from the monopoly of the East India Company, India came to be considered as a lucrative field for British private capital investment, chiefly in railways, jute industry, tea plantation, and mining. Indian money market was dominated by the European banking houses. One major reason why the Indian entrepreneurs failed and their European counterparts thrived was the latter's greater access to and command over capital, facilitated by their connections with the banks and agency houses, while the Indians had to depend on their kins, families, and castemen. 111 On the other hand, British economic interests in India operated through the chambers of commerce and the managing agency houses, which influenced government policies and eliminated indigenous competition. The managing agencies, controlled by the British merchant adventurers, offer an interesting story of economic domination of expatriate capital. These were private partnership firms, which controlled through legal contracts a host of joint rock companies, with no obligations to their shareholders. Thus a large firm like Andrew Yule would control about 60 companies in 1917. They preferred racial exclusivism and autonomy, and resisted all attempts at integration. On the eve of World War I, there were about 60 such agency houses, dominating jute industry, coal mining, and tea plantations, controlling 75% of the industrial capital in India and almost half of the total industrial employment. So whatever industrialization that did occur was mostly, though not exclusively, through British capital, with the profits being regularly repatriated. And the major factors that favored this development were the discriminatory official policies. An ideal example of such economic favoritism was the tea plantation in Assam, which was developed in 1833. Sponsorship of the government, seeking to reduce import of expensive tea from China. Later, plantations were transferred to individual capitalist ownership, and here native investors were deliberately ignored. The Inland Emigration Act of 1859 secured them a steady supply of labor, by preventing the migrant workers from leaving the plantation sites. Tea industry remained dominated by British capital until the 1950s, so was coal mining in eastern India. The development of jute industry in Bengal is another interesting saga that needs to be recounted here. Jute as a cheap substitute for flax was developed in the early 19th century, and Bengal remained the chief supplier of raw jute for the industries in Dundee. In 1855 the first jute mill was started in Bengal, and then closeness to sources of raw materials and cheap labor gave it a competitive edge over the Scottish industry. The opening of the Australasian markets in the late 19th century, World War I and the wartime demand hike gave the industry a real push. The amount of paid-up capital in jute industry increased from 79.3 million in 1914 to 15 to 106.4 million in 1918 to 19 to 179.4 million in 1922 to 23. Bulk of the capital invested was British capital, organized through the Indian Jute Mills Association, IJMA, which controlled output in order to maintain high prices. The profitability of the industry continued until the Great Depression, when both exports and net profits began to decline. 180 However, this dominance of expatriate capital notwithstanding, from the 1920s some Calcutta-based Marwaris, who had made money as traders and chauffeurs, began to intrude into this exclusive sphere and started investing in jute industry. First, through buying stocks and lending money, many of the Marwaris got themselves elected to the boards of the European managing agencies. And then, people like G. D. Birla and Swarupchand Hukumchand set up their own mills in 1922. This marked the beginning of Indian jute mills around Calcutta, as in this decade 1 Armenian and 6 Indian mills were started, accounting for over 10% of the loomage. In the 1930s this position was further consolidated, as some mills dared to operate outside the control mechanism of the IJMA, thus challenging the hegemony of expatriate capital in this industry. This Marwari stranglehold was gradually extended to other sectors, like coal mines, sugar mills, and paper industry. Between 1942 and 1945, they began to take over some of the European companies, so that by 1950, argues Omkar Goswami, they were poised to take over almost all the older industries in the region which had hitherto been dominated by European capital. While Tomlinson would ascribe this development to the flight of expatriate capital, decolonization, 112 Goswami would give more credit to Marwari entrepreneurial skills. The real success of Indian industrialists, however, came in the cotton industry of Western India. Until the beginning of World War I, imported textiles dominated Indian markets. This import considerably declined during the war, more than halved between 1913-14 and 1917-18, partly because of transport dislocations caused by the war and partly due to 7.5% import duty on cotton textiles imposed in 1917. The Japanese competition was not so serious yet, while on the other hand, excise duty on Indian textiles remained static at 3.5%. In addition, there was the military demand and the call for Swadeshi, proposing a boycott of foreign goods and the use of their indigenous alternatives. Cotton industry existed in India before World War I, and along with the European managing agencies, certain traditional trading communities like the Gujarati Baniyas, Parsis, Bohras, and Bhatias, who made money through export trade with China, had maintained their presence in this sector. But as opportunities contracted and their subordination in export trade of raw cotton became more constrictive, they began to diversify into manufacturing as a strategy for survival. The development of cotton industry went through three distinctive phases. It had its early beginning in Bombay in the 1870s and 1880s, its diversification beyond Bombay began in the 1890s, first to Ahmedabad, and then to other centers like Sholapur or Kanpur, its major expansion coming after World War I, and in the 1920s, the third phase of its development came in the 1930s when it withstood the initial pressures of depression and then began to expand. The industry remained dependent on foreign collaboration for imported machinery, chemicals, and technological expertise. But technology was not the most crucial factor behind its growth, which depended on three things, as Rajnarayan Chandavrakar has identified them, i.e., relentless improvisation in the use of old machinery, the manipulation of raw materials and the exploitation of cheap labor. Although import of cheap Japanese goods threatened its growth temporarily in the 1930s, by the rime of World War II, the Indian cotton industry had established an unchallenged monopoly over its vast domestic market, and began competing with Lancashire in foreign markets. 114 Iron and steel industry, under the leadership of Tata Iron and Steel Company, FLSCO, began at the turn of the century under direct government patronage. Because, here the monopoly of the Birmingham steel industry had already been broken by Continental. Except in matters of government and railway orders. Revision of store purchase policy during World War I and protection after the war provided a real push to the growth of TISCO. But during World War II, when there was another opportunity for expansion, the government showed a strange unconcern. 18s But by then, 1938-39, TISCO was producing on an average 682,500 tons or 66% of the steel consumed in India. Apart from cotton, textiles and steel, the other industries that developed during the interwar period were shipping, coal, paper, sugar, glass, safety matches and chemical industries. It is true that protection after World War I, motivated by fiscal compulsions and the need for a local power base, stimulated growth in a number of manufacturing industries in India. But their growth potential was limited to domestic market alone, which remained consistently depressed, given the massive poverty of the Indian population. The situation could only improve through effective government intervention, which was not forthcoming. More on industrialization and industrialists in Chapter 7.3. If the government policies and the stranglehold of British capital inhibited Indian enterprise in certain sectors, recent researches show that below the West and East enclave and above the subsistence economy of the peasants, there was an intermediate level, the bazaar, where Indian businessmen and bankers continued to operate. This tier consisted of the sectors where either the returns were too low or risks too high to attract European investors, who confined themselves to sure bets, or the exclusive spheres protected by the empire. 186 This phenomenon, which Rajith Ray has called the imperial division of economic space, 187, provided a sphere of operation, though less rewarding and more risky, for the enterprising communities from Gujarat, Rajasthan, or Tamil Nadu. The recent micro-study of Bihar by Anand Yang shows how the bazaar provided a profitable ground for the operations of the indigenous merchant scum bankers from the mid-18th century right up to the period of the Gandhian movements in the 20th. 188 Some of these indigenous firms took advantage of the new opportunities of the empire, such as the railways and telegraph, and ran sophisticated and fairly integrated business networks that covered the whole of the subcontinent. These firms later expanded overseas to China, Burma, Straits Settlement, Middle East, and East Africa. It was these operations which generated indigenous capital, which was later invested in industries after World War I, when the imperial economic policies began to slacken due to multifarious pressures, both financial and political. India's underdevelopment was therefore not due to any lack of entrepreneurial skill. This brings us back to the point where we began, economic factors, like fluctuating exchange rates, trade depressions, etc., or the vagaries of nature. This brings us back to the point where we began, i.e., India's economic and financial obligations to the empire, and how did it fulfill them till the end of the imperial connection. Between 1880 and World War I, successive financial crises showed that India was incapable of shouldering the financial burden of serving the empire. The financial crises were due to various reasons, such as greater Indian demands for a share of resources. Development of an articulate political opinion made any increase in internal taxation rate a risky proposition. There were also the macroeconomic factors, like fluctuating exchange rates, trade depressions, etc., or the vagaries of nature. These led to the weakening of the imperial goal and resulted in greater devolution of power. Gradually import tariffs were imposed against British textile, which virtually amounted to a protection for Indian industries. There was also a shift in British industrial economy, and the Indian market lost its importance for the growth sectors in British economy. British investments in Indian capital market also declined, so did the use of Indian army for the defense of empire. The Indian army could still be used, but the cost had to be borne by London or by the dependent colony, which needed it. Thus, gradually India's role in the greater imperial structure was subordinated to its own domestic requirements. The imperial goal and ideology were muted to accommodate pressures built up in India, both financial and political. This diminution of imperial economic interests in India is regarded by some historians as a major factor behind the decision to transfer power.